So far in our series of talks with Hastings author Victoria Seymour, we've spoken to Victoria about her books, Letters from Lavender Cottage, The Long Road to Lavender Cottage and Caught in the Act, all of which can be heard here on Hastings Local Radio. Like all of her previous books on Hastings' wartime and post-war social histories, today we speak to Victoria on the final book in the series written by Victoria called Victory's Children. Victoria, can you tell us what Victory's Children is all about?
It tells the story in two parts. The most interesting part to me are the actual Victory's children, who are now, of course, no longer children. But I interviewed 27 people who told me the story of their wartime childhood and how they felt and what they experienced when victory came. The other part of the book is about Hastings throughout the 12 months of 1945, and what was happening in the town, how it was getting on its feet again.
And from your own perspective as a juvenile yourself during the war, you say in your book that your time consisted of two time periods, before the war and after the war, and you were around about the age 14, I believe, when you moved from Chislehurst down to Fairlight with your parents. And you say in your book you were delighted and excited about moving to the seaside, but also shocked by the huge number of bombed buildings that you saw in Hastings when you arrived.
Yes, it really presented a terrible picture because Hastings is a small town and the houses are close together. It just looked that so much worse. There was lots of bombing in Chislehurst where I lived, but it was an area where there were many large houses and you couldn't so easily walk down a street and see one house after another either destroyed or seriously damaged. And of course I had a child's idyllic view of the seaside, and I imagined I was going to come to somewhere like you see in the picture books, and it was not like that entirely.
It must have been quite a traumatic experience for a 14-year-old to actually see that.
Yes, it was. And it was many years before Hastings was tidied up, although the bomb sites had been cleared. There were still these great gaps in the building, and many of them went on well into the 60s.
Your book gives a month-by-month account throughout the year of 1945, and if we start in January 1945, you feature the subject of food supplies being supplied to the people of Hastings in Havelock Road. Apparently, Hastings councillors approved the idea, but it did cause quite a bit of controversy.
A scheme was set up during the war of British restaurants, where people could go and get a meal in addition to their rations for what now we regard as a few pence, 9 pence or a shilling. And the council were keen to open these British restaurants, and Ferrari's Italian restaurant had been vacant for some years because the owners, being Italians, were interned, and the council wanted to open a British restaurant there. But the cafeterias roundabout objected because they claimed they could serve equally good meals at the same price, and it would be taking custom away from them. So after much discussion, the idea was dropped.
So would children have been able to eat at these particular places had it have happened?
Children did eat there, but it wasn't just for children, it was for the entire populace. Because a lot of women had been evacuated with their young children, many men were left on their own, and it was a place for them to go and get a hot meal every day because there was no one at home to cook it for them. I went there and went to a British restaurant myself as a child, and the food was basic, solid, filling.
Can you give us some examples of what was served up in those days?
Stew. Stew. Corned beef, boiled potatoes and salad. More stew, hearty pudding, suet pudding, milk puddings, tapioca pudding, frog spawn as the children used to call it. But during the war, most children had a little edge of hunger, so you'd be prepared to eat anything.
Unlike today, where they can pop into a shop and have a snack.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, you talk about Morrison Shelters in your book. Can you explain what these Morrison Shelters were?
Yes. Morrison Shelters were huge steel cages that were delivered to people's homes and could be erected in a suitable place in the house. There were single-decker Morrison Shelters for where there was a small family, or double-deckers where there's a bigger family, or a domestic setup where it wasn't suitable for people to share the same bed. They had steel tops and supports. They're extremely heavy, but they saved many, many lives. The one we had took up most of the room because we lived in a small house, and after a while the top became a sort of an extension to the mantelpiece, and all sorts of things were put on it. And if anything fell down the back, it was there till the war was over because they were just unmovable.
So who used to install the Morrison Shelters?
I think at some time the Boy Scouts helped, neighbours helped. My father certainly installed ours with the help of my brothers or anyone they could get hold of.
And presumably they were delivered on lorries or something like that?
Yes, they were, piece by piece.
Right.
And then, of course, there was a problem of disposing of them after the war. People thought they were going to get money back if they were in a position where they had to buy them. We didn't have to buy ours because we were too hard up. But years after the war, you could still see bits and pieces of them. On the farm at Fairlight, where I moved in 1948, the steel tops were used to put in front of farm machinery in the fields to cover the mud. And the metal supports were used to hold up workbenches.
Oh, right. So they after the war days, they still come in handy.
Yes.
One of the major problems for children in Hastings during the Second World War, apart from food rationing and disease, was the injuries that some of the children sustained while playing with illicitly obtained explosives. I mean, there were, for example, you mentioned in the book about lots of detonators that were hanging around all over the places, especially up at places like Fairlight, at the cliffs at Fairlight and that.
Yes, and if I may, I'll read a brief extract from the book. On the 2nd of May 1945, two local boys, Edward Stevenson, aged 16, and Ronald Reeves, 14, were admitted to hospital with serious injuries as a result of an explosion of a mine detonator on Ecclesbourne Cliffs. The Observer reported, "The boys were together on the East Hill when one of them found a detonator. A fire is said to have been started on which the detonator was placed, the boys suffering in the resulting explosion. They were rushed to the Royal East Sussex Hospital in a serious condition with injuries and shock. The mine detonator is believed to have been one of more than 50 which were missing after the clearance of the coastal area in the neighbourhood of Fairlight. A search had been made for the others and a warning had been circulated to local schools about the danger of tampering with them. They contained 4 ounces of high explosive with fuse arrangements, which made them extremely dangerous for inexperienced persons to handle." It wasn't just this, boys would get hold of anything that they could anywhere to get up to mischief. One cause of a number of fatalities, not necessarily locally, were the huge static water tanks which were set up around the town to supply water, emergency water supplies in the case of fire. And boys would try swimming in them and drown, or they would try to skate on them when they were frozen over and the ice would tilt and they'd be drowned. But then, of course, boys are hopelessly adventurous.
Aren't they just? Absolutely. In May 1945, Winston Churchill announced that the war was over, and that resulted in an eruption of celebrations all over the UK. And you mentioned in your book some 10,000 Hastings people gathered in Alexandra Park for a Thanksgiving service, and there were dozens and dozens and dozens of street parties all over the town, weren't there?
There were. In Hastings and St Leonard's, there were about 55. It took so long for them to be set up over a period of months, or weeks rather, that by the time they'd finished, we were into August and we had victory over Japan, so we had another round of street parties. It's astonishing where people got the food from. Of course, it was nothing luxurious, but I think for the children it was just the thrill of bringing out the tables and the chairs and eating together in the street. It was mainly probably sandwiches, spam sandwiches, I expect, Marmite sandwiches, rock buns, more rock than bun, I think. And there would be dancing, many stories of pianos being dragged into the street, races, games. Many children of my generation look back with pleasure on those particular events.
And of course, lots and lots of bunting all over the place.
Oh, yes.
It must have been very, very colourful in those days.
Well, it's amazing where that came from. People dragged it out. Perhaps they'd been saving it against the day of victory. But yes, it did look colourful.
When you discovered personally the war was over, as a teenager, can you recall how you felt at hearing the news?
I was 10 and a half at the time. I was immensely excited. I felt great joy and at last this time after the war had arrived, this time that the grown-ups spoke about, oh yes, after the war, when the war's over, this was going to be the wonderful fairy tale time when everything was perfect. I did actually dance for joy. I was so excited and happy. Living as close to London and being so involved in what the war meant on the home front, it was a great relief.
Is there one memory that stands out from all the others for you that you remember from the war days as a child yourself?
Yes, there are many, most of them associated with fear in varying degrees. There are two I'd like to mention. Sitting up in bed with my mother one night, we hadn't got our Morrison shelter then. We hadn't drawn the curtains, we hadn't got any blackout, so we sat in the darkness and seeing outside the planes, the guns, the sky full of light. We were just hanging on to each other in terror. And another occasion involving my mother when I was coming home from school and one of the flying bombs was approaching, and she could hear it and I could hear it, and she was at the front door screaming at me, "Run, run," as if it would have made any difference, but I know she wanted just to get hold of me because of this danger. But the flying bomb moved on and exploded somewhere else, but that was truly terrifying.
I imagine, I can't imagine what it must have been like, because it was terror. You were restricted in where you could go. You couldn't do what children would normally do growing up, go out on the streets and play, although possibly you could do, but there was an element of danger.
Yes.
Then you never knew when the next air raid strike was going to happen.
We did go out in the street and play. Yes, there was a danger, but of course we all knew when to run. And another thing which people don't realise, that when you got up and went about your day's business and said goodbye, you could never be sure you were going to see each other at the end of the day. And of course many people didn't.
Those were sad days, and thank goodness they're over. Victoria, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you about all of your books, especially the one we've just spoken about, Victory's Children, and of course your other books in the series. Thank you very much again for sharing some wonderful and fascinating stories and some not so nice stories in your book. Whereabouts can people actually get hold of a copy of Victory's Children?
They can get hold of them at your store in All Village, the White Rock stores on the seafront, the Hastings Information Centre, Waterstones, and also a very new outlet. I'm selling them in East Hastings Sea Angling Association, with the profits going to their funds. Also, they can be bought from my website, victoriaseymour.com.
Victoria, as I said, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much, and all the best to you in the future.
Thank you.
This audio broadcast is copyright. No reproduction in whole or in part is permitted without prior written permission from Hastings Local Radio, the copyright owner.